The Prime Minister is being assailed from within. In the recent past, his political allies have said they have never trusted him. They have accused him of sexism and racism, and women from within his party have accused him of being menacing and controlling, and described him as a person who lacks a moral compass. His former rival for the seat of Cook has eviscerated him, and his own Deputy PM has called him a liar and a hypocrite. Given his party room thinks so little of him, why should women of Australia vote for him?
Thanks so much for your question, Marley. Well, look, before we get to the politicians, Sam, we might start with you on that. Well, it's a big challenge for the Prime Minister at the moment, all the attacks on him right now. The question goes to women in particular, but it mentions a lot of issues that he's having to fend off.
Well, it's quite a roll call, but we should say it's not just women who have made some complaints about the Prime Minister. As the question noted, the Deputy Prime Minister had some rather unkind things to say in that text message. I think that Prime Ministers before have copped this sort of criticism. Mean and tricky memo, you remember with John Howard.
Very well.
The lying rodent, which was allegedly said by one of John Howard's team in the lead up to the 2014 election. I think what's different this time around is the volume of it. Now, obviously, they will dismiss this and say that these people are disgruntled. I'm sure that Anne will have something to say about that shortly. But it's quite it's a volume of people, and I think that's the problem that the Prime Minister has got, because some voters will say, well, where there's smoke, there's fire.
Anne, can I get you to respond to the question? Why should people, or women in particular, vote for the Prime Minister given all of that?
Well, I don't imagine there's anybody that's sitting on the panel tonight, people who are in public life who hasn't had a sledging sometime in their career. I sure know that I have. But what I would say is that, the timing of much of what has come out certainly has to be questioned, and we should be calling it out for that, because, on the eve of an election, we start seeing these things coming out of the woodwork. I would question whether it is actually a political hit job. But can I say, I can only speak from my own personal experience. I mean, I've worked with the Prime Minister for 10 years, closely with the Prime Minister for the last 3 years as in his cabinet. And I've got to say that the commentary that I have heard by some of these people is just not the Scott Morrison that I know. The Scott Morrison I know is the man who, when I asked him, to make sure that we were supporting, with great investment into the next national plan to end violence against women and children, was immediately, understood what we needed and was prepared to commit to it. So I can only say that the Scott Morrison I know is a completely different person to some of the things that I've heard in the media of recent times.
I'll go to the rest of the panel, but just while I've got you, you mentioned the timing and it being a political hit job, but that actually makes the point, doesn't it? When you're heading into a hotly contested election, as this one is, when the polls are indicating you've got an opposition that's clearly competitive, the fact that your own would be prepared to come out of the woodwork, using their own names, using their own faces, and say what they are saying about the Prime Minister, actually amplifies the point that they are so disenchanted with him, they derail their party's own chances of winning.
Well, I mean, unfortunately, when you're the Prime Minister or when you're in any leadership position, you can't say yes, and people are disappointed. I suppose I'm very disappointed at the way the disappointed people have responded with some of their public commentary. But, unfortunately, sometimes people do make public commentary and it gets picked up, and now we're having a conversation about it. But, I'm very focused on making sure that I do what the Australian public are expecting of me as a politician, and that's looking after their interests and not talking about this kind of stuff.
You've spoken, Clare O'Neill, about male entitlement in Parliament before, and watched this closely. What's your response?
I actually don't see it as much from a gender lens, so I haven't worked very closely with the Prime Minister. What I did notice in my electorate was at the last election, I think, Scott Morrison came into the job and he was elected as Prime Minister quite soon after. And he seemed to get this staggy dad sort of feel across, and a lot of my constituents that I talked to really felt that this is who this person is. And the truth is that Scott Morrison is the most strategic politician in the Parliament. That is really saying something. Like, he is a politician to his absolute core. And the thing that really gets me about the conduct I see in Parliament is he has a fundamental problem with telling the truth. And that's the thing that I can't get over, because I know that people think politicians are all liars, but Scott Morrison is in a new territory of his own. I see it in Parliament. He stands on his feet and he says, things that are on camera, him saying, you know, months or years ago, he just denies ever saying it. And this has just happened again and again and again. And we're going into this election context. We've got 6 weeks. And I do think it's going to be really hard for Australians to feel that they can put their trust in him to do what he says he will do, to not do what he says he won't do again, because they've just experienced this now for 3 years. And I do think they've kind of worked out who the man is and what his character is.
Gideon, I'll take you to the question, but interestingly as well, and we should all reflect on this, and Sam, I'd like your view on it too, the fact that Matthew Kamanzuli, the former New South Wales Liberal Party member, he's won special leave from the High Court now to challenge the endorsement of those candidates that were led, championed and some might say steamrolled by Alex Hawke and also by the Prime Minister. How's all that going to play out, Gideon?
Look, I think it's another mess, and I think the fact that we're talking about these things in part shows how Scott Morrison has lost control of the agenda, and the reason for that is because he has both parties, frankly, have very few things to say about actual policies. I don't know Scott Morrison. I can't talk to the veracity of these claims. My concern is what Scott Morrison has done to the Liberal Party and to liberalism, to the values that I've subscribed to. My concern is the fact that the Morrison government has embroiled Australia in $1 trillion debt, that it's ramped up online censorship, that it made it a criminal offence for Australian citizens during the pandemic to re-enter their own country, rendering them stateless. The Morrison government engaged in that awful state-sanctioned theft that was robo-debt. I think those are much more important issues to talk to the Prime Minister's character and his judgment and his leadership. And I have to say, Scott Morrison would have to be, in my opinion, the worst Prime Minister the Liberal Party has put up since Billy McMahon, except Billy McMahon had principles.
I might have to give Anne Ruston a right of reply on that, I think. Sam Maiden, you've watched him very closely in the Parliament. Is Clare O'Neill gone too far in his description of who he is and how he operates?
I think that Scott Morrison is a shapeshifter, right? And the criticism of Anthony Albanese is that no one knows who he is. I think the problem for Scott Morrison is that everybody does. And, you know, Scott Morrison's problem going into this election is 100% Scott Morrison. That's the lead in his saddlebags. And I mean, I don't mean that to be unkind. It's just an observation of mine as a political journalist, right? I mean, he had the advantage of the last campaign that he was relatively new. There was a freshness to the government, even though they'd been in government for a long time. This time around, you know, he has that triumvirate of issues, which is reflected in the news poll when the government has dipped. And each time the dip has been greater, the crater has been greater. The first was, of course, in relation to nicking off to Hawaii and having a holiday while the nation burned. The next was in relation to the allegations of abuse at Parliament House. Once again, the dip in news poll was greater than Hawaii. And finally, the greatest one was the vaccine rollout. Now, each time there has been a recovery, but you see now that their primary vote is very low. And yeah, I mean, you do see it all the time that the Prime Minister will say, oh, I didn't say that, I meant this, or someone asked me this, but I actually meant to say this, oh, I never said that. And it gets a little intriguing.
Steph, you used to want to be a politician.
I know, what a loser.
Thanks a lot, Steph. Thanks a lot.
No, I'm sorry.
Steph, there's still time. There's still time.
No, I always had this idea that I could enact change in the world, and I don't think that politics is where it lies. Because the politics gets in the way of politics. I think politics is so out of touch with society. I mean, like, I have this dream that we get a panel, like a jury of 12 random people from all around Australia, and they help make decisions. Because the whole thing is, with politicians, you train to become a politician. You know, you spend your life living the experiences that a person who wants to be a politician lives. It's like, you know, nurses, we send them out to rural towns and remote areas. There's, you know, a really big push on their resumes that if they've got overseas travel or volunteer work, that's all a plus. Politicians, just be white and a man, you know, and but I actually had a question. So for you, you asked the question. Can I ask how old you are?
I'm 18.
Yeah, so your peers, are a lot of your peers interested in politics?
I'd be the most interested out of my peers.
Because your question is super politically savvy, like you're really taking note of what's happening, but people like the generation just under me, I've noticed, are the most politically savvy. This is the most politically in touch society I've ever seen, and yet they have no interest in politics, which tells you everything about our politicians. You know what I mean?
I blame TikTok.
Yeah.
It can't just be TikTok.